are sort of shifting gears a little bit. We are moving into a new narrative, sort of the story of Joseph starts in chapter 37. So here's where we really start to get to know Joseph, who is, of course, one of the very important figures in the book of Genesis. Honestly, if we wanted to, we probably could spend the entire class just covering his life. I say there's more space in Genesis dedicated to Joseph and his story than any other figure in the Old Testament. He's got something like 13 chapters that's dedicated to his story. So a hugely important figure in sort of the overarching story of Genesis, in the history of the Hebrew people, and of course in salvation history on the whole. Today, though, what I wanted to do was focus a little bit on the story of Judah. So honestly, we don't really hear a whole lot about him. We don't really talk about him as much as Joseph, and rightfully so. Again, most of the text and the later part of Genesis is dedicated to Joseph instead of Judah. But at the same time, Judah himself is also very important because he is the one who God chooses as the ancestor of Jesus Christ. And so to start talking about him, I think it's first important to note that he's really an unlikely ancestor for the Lord. For one reason, just because of the order of his birth. So if we think about the order that all of Jacob's children were born, he was born fourth. Which generally speaking, for families in that time, the fourth son usually wasn't terribly important. Usually was, of course, the first son was most important. And so for him to be the one who ends up becoming the heir of Jacob, it's pretty incredible in and of itself. You also tie this in with the fact that he was the son of Leah, not Rachel. So he was the son of the wife who was less favored by Jacob. And then too, just thinking about the character of Judah early on, contrasting him with Joseph is really something else, because if we were to really think about it, comparing the two, we'd ask, okay, well, which one would be the more suitable ancestor for the Lord? For me, anyway, if I'm just looking at the two guys, I would think the natural choice would be Joseph, right? He's the one who's gifted. He's the golden boy. He's the son of Rachel, and he's a dreamer, and he's also righteous and faithful. Compared to Judah, who starts off, kind of rocky. Because we think back to the story of the raid that Jacob's sons take on Shechem. So this is the story of when, remember, Simeon and Levi sneak into the town when everybody's recovering from their little procedure, and they end up killing all the men of the city. As far as we know, Judah himself didn't take part in actually murdering anybody in the city, but nonetheless, he did take part in the looting afterwards. So we know for sure that almost all of Jacob's sons at the time took part in taking the goods from the city after all the men were dead. So that's not really a great start for him if he's building up a resume to be the ancestor of Jesus Christ. And then, of course, once Joseph is born and he starts coming of age, he, along with the rest of his brothers, is really overcome by jealousy for Joseph. He's very envious of the place that he has in the families. We remember Jacob is not shy about playing favorites amongst the kids. He's very open that Joseph is in fact his favorite son, and he gives him the coat and he gives him authority over his brothers, which understandably makes the other guys none too happy. And of course, Judah is amongst them. And then, of course, we come to the point when Joseph goes to check on his brothers, and they are just really fed up with him, and they say, okay, well, we're done with it. We're just going to kill him. Of course, Reuben intervenes and says, no, let's not do that. But it's Judah who's the one who says, well, you know what, we're getting rid of the kid. Why don't we make a quick buck off of him, and we'll sell him into slavery. So then again, so that's the early part of the story of Judah. Not really a great guy from the start. And then we move into chapter 38 of Genesis, which, just reading through the story, it's really an abrupt shift in the narrative. So we go from the story of Joseph, and all of a sudden we start focusing on Judah for this chapter. The chapter begins with Judah basically running away from the family. So he follows the example of his uncle Esau, and he says, well, you know what, I think I'm just going to strike off on my own. I'm going to go hang out with the Canaanites. And he ends up marrying a Canaanite woman named Shua. So this is something that again is a mistake that his uncle Esau made, and it's something that was a really big no-no for this particular family, for the family that had been chosen by God to produce the Messiah. And this goes back, we remember, all the way to Noah, right? So Noah famously cursed his son Ham and his grandson Canaan because they were wicked and they betrayed him. And then the descendants of Ham and Canaan famously persisted in their sinfulness and rebellion against God. So for this reason, we remember in the story of Abraham, when he sends a servant off to go find a wife for his son Isaac, he specifically says, do not find a woman from the Canaanites for my son. So he's not to intermarry with the Canaanites. And the same thing with Isaac. When Jacob goes off on his own, Isaac says the same thing. He says, do not intermarry with the Canaanites. So it's a really big deal for this family, but nonetheless, Judah decides to break the taboo, and he does exactly what he's not supposed to do. So he ends up having 3 sons with Shua, Onan, and Shelah. And looking at the very, very brief descriptions of the first 2 sons, and Onan, we get an idea for why it was such a big deal to this family to not intermarry with the Canaanites. The reason is because there was a fear that the faith of this particular family would be put in jeopardy, that they would be corrupted by the people of Canaan. And sure enough, Judah's first 2 sons, and Onan, we don't know exactly what it was that they did or what sins they fell into, but the text tells us that they fell into sin and they were unrepentant, wicked, and so God took their lives in judgment. So that left 1 son for Judah, Shelah, and of course we remember that as his first son, came of age, he had arranged a marriage for him with another Canaanite woman named Tamar. So of course when he dies, they follow the customs of the time, and she is then engaged to Onan. So they get married, and Onan dies. So the custom was she should have been married off to the 3rd and last son, Shelah. But Judah says, okay, well, I've lost 2 out of my 3 sons. I don't think you're going to get anywhere near my 3rd boy, because I need to pass on the family name and preserve the family. So what he does is he sends her back home, essentially. And so I say here, Judah repeats family mistakes. One, Esau, I already mentioned, he decided to go and intermarry with the Canaanites. And then he's also repeating the mistake of his father Jacob in that he's not dealing honestly with people, because he promises Tamar. He says, okay, well, once my last son comes of age, then you two can get married. You'll be taken care of. Don't worry. And then he says, no, just kidding. You need to go away. You need to go home. This was a really nasty thing for him to do, because at the time, for a woman to be left widowed and childless was a really rough position to be in, because then she would have had no one to take care of her, because of course women at the time didn't have the means to go out and work and own property and all the rest of it to take care of themselves. So Tamar was really just stuck with her father, who had no obligation whatsoever to take care of her, given the customs of the time. Because as the daughter-in-law of Judah, she was under his household. And so where's the story? As the story goes, Judah's wife passes away, and then Judah, on a trip, passes by Tamar, who decides to pull a fast one on him and dress up as a prostitute, and Judah unwittingly sleeps with her. Not that it makes it any better that she would be a prostitute. And so she conceives twins from that encounter, and of course it comes out that word comes to Judah. He says, "Oh, hey, your daughter-in-law is pregnant, so she hasn't been faithful. She's committed adultery." And so he says, "Okay, well, then she gets the death penalty. We're going to burn her for that." But of course, he himself was guilty of the same sin. So again, not really an especially good look for him. And then he, of course, discovers that she was the woman that he slept with, and the children are his. And she ends up having twin boys, Perez and Zerah. What's interesting about this encounter is this really acts as a turning point for Judah. So we see really a major shift in his character, from somebody who is really has no qualms whatsoever about being dishonest and stealing and all the rest of it. He takes the time to acknowledge his sin. He actually does confess, and he says, he openly says, she's more righteous than I am. So he acknowledges the truth of what he did, and then later in the story we see a real change in who he is. Eventually, at one point, he will offer to sacrifice himself on behalf of Benjamin. And so he goes from somebody who's very selfish and not really interested in the good of the family, to somebody who's willing to offer his life on behalf of his brother. And so for Judah, I think it's worth reflecting on his life a little bit more than what I think we kind of are tempted to, just because his story is stuck just right in the middle of Joseph's story. He's a really interesting figure, because he starts off really rough, but then he's really sort of a prime example of the power of repentance. And so he does end up becoming a good and righteous character. He later, when Jacob is dying and he's giving a blessing to all of his sons, the first of his sons that he gives any sort of positive words to, any sort of affirmation, is to Judah, who's really stepped into the role of leader of the family. And so I think it really goes to show sort of the incredible foresight that God had in choosing him. Because he knew that if Judah, as Judah repented, he would become a great man, and he would end up producing the royal line of Israel, which would give us David and Solomon and many other righteous kings as well, and then ultimately the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And so I want to take just a second to talk a little bit about Joseph. Be kind of remiss if I didn't mention anything about him. So there's a little Andy Dwyer from Parks and Rec. If you all have seen that show. And so specifically tonight, I wanted to focus on the troubles that we see Joseph getting into in these chapters. So we see two really serious tragedies befall him. One, of course, is the first one, the betrayal by his brothers. If you think about just how traumatic that must have been for anybody, it's amazing that he remained faithful just after that. So you just imagine, you're stuck in this pit, and you've got your brothers talking about whether they're going to kill you or throw you into slavery. That's a really horrible thing. It must have shaken him up, and then of course he ends up getting sold into slavery, and he goes to a foreign country, and he's totally helpless. He's a slave. He has no rights, no assets. He has nothing. And then of course he's sold into the household of Potiphar, who is who's an officer in Pharaoh's court, and it doesn't take long for him to do well there, even as a slave. But then of course Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. Joseph remains faithful, though. So there's again, it's kind of another interesting contrast between Joseph and his brother Judah. So of course, Potiphar's wife is not happy that he doesn't agree to commit adultery, and she falsely accuses him of sexual assault, essentially. And then he's thrown into prison for a long time, for years. He's stuck in prison. So these are two things which, on their own, really could have broken him. It would break a good number of people. Being falsely imprisoned, just like being betrayed by your family, those closest to you, had to have been an incredibly hard thing for him to go through. But there's a refrain in chapter 39. There's the phrase, "The Lord was with Joseph." So we see that repeated 4 times. We know that that's something that the text is really trying to emphasize to us. That even in spite of everything, in spite of all these horrible things that happened to Joseph, God is still with him all the same. These bad experiences, just like the good ones that Joseph went through. So of course, growing up as the favored son and having sort of a sense of having some responsibilities and some authority in the family was clearly good for his development. In the household of Potiphar, he made the best of his situation, and he was a good servant, and he had a great deal of authority there in the house. And even in prison, he made the best of his circumstances there, and he gained favor with the guards, and he had as much authority as a prisoner possibly could there at the time. So these experiences, good and bad, really prepare him for what was to come. And that was ultimately to become, I guess you could call it the vizier or the prime minister of Pharaoh's court. Joseph would eventually rise to become the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, which was an incredibly powerful country. It was a superpower at the time. And so for him to rise from slave, prisoner to second most powerful man in the country, one of the most powerful men in the world, honestly is something really incredible. But it's important to remember that this didn't happen overnight for him. Really, it was a lifetime of preparation. God taking him through good and bad experiences that prepared him to do this. I think there we can take kind of a devotional insight from this, because of course in our own lives we all have our own experiences, good and bad. Life isn't a rose garden for sure for everybody. There's always pain and suffering for all of us. But nonetheless, if we think back to the story of Joseph, we are assured, just as we see in chapter 39 over and over again, the Lord is with you. So we can rest in the fact that no matter what we're going through, God is always with us. He is always there for us. And ultimately, all the experiences that we're taken through in life are meant for our good, and they're meant for our growth, and they're meant to make us stronger, even the hardest things. I'd say maybe even especially the hardest things. And to be sure, most of us, I don't think are being groomed by God to be the ruler of a superpower anytime soon. With that said, though, in the end, we are all being prepared to be princes and princesses in the kingdom of heaven. That's something that every single one of us is called to. We are all called to rule alongside Jesus Christ, our God and Savior and Lord and brother, for eternity. We are going to rule alongside him and govern the cosmos. That's what we're called to. And so, I think, as we go through difficult circumstances in life, it's very tempting for us to sort of lose track of that. And I think the story of Joseph helps us to kind of step back a little bit and keep that bigger picture in mind. So that, I think, is all I had. Yep, it is. I actually finished on time. So. All right, does anybody have any burning questions or anything? We've got like another minute or two, but if not, then we can go ahead and close with prayer.